Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Hastings, executive producer for World Channel. I'd like to welcome you to our Tribal Sovereignty and Home online screening event, presented in partnership with Vision Maker Media. We present tonight's event as part of our ongoing effort and mission to support and amplify voices from diverse communities. We'd like to acknowledge that the land we are streaming from, Boston, Massachusetts, are the original homelands of the Mashpee Wampanoag, the Aquana Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, and the Massachusetts tribal nations. We recognize the painful history of Native genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people still connected to this land in which we work and live. During tonight's event, we want you to share in this collective conversation, dive into the stories that we're going to share, and we encourage you to use the QA box to share your comments and questions with our panel. I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague, Charlie Perry of Vision Maker Media, who helped us put this event together this evening. He's going to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing and who our moderator is. So, Charlie, I turn it over to you.
Migush for that wonderful introduction, Chris. Bozo Nikanens, Nadeshakas Matankwaki, Asen Balawadami. My name is Charlie Perry. I hail from the Firekeeper Nation of the Prairie Band Potawatomi of Mayetta, Kansas. I'm also the Assistant Director of Vision Maker Media. I'm humbled and honored to be a part of tonight's panel. In celebration of Native American and Alaska Native Heritage Month, Vision Maker Media, in partnership with the World Channel, presents Tribal Sovereignty and Home, a community-themed online film streaming event, November 16th through the 30th. Tribal Sovereignty and Home is free and open to the public for online streaming at visionmakermedia.org. Tribal Sovereignty and Home showcases Native American topics that have long resonated within Native communities in the United States, such as Native nation sovereignty, empowerment, history, and healing. The curated selection includes 6 films that further educate audiences about the histories, battles, and accomplishments of Native Americans. 2 documentaries focus on Indian child welfare and Native Americans' contribution to American music, while the remaining documentaries center on activism, civil rights, environment, and social justice stories from 4 different Native communities. Vision Maker and the World Channel have enjoyed a partnership spanning over a decade, with the shared purpose of bringing Native Americans to the forefront in broadcast television. Meeting both the World Channel's mission to inform and inspire with real stories from around the world, and Vision Maker's goal of empowering and engaging Native people to share their stories. Jenny Monet, Laguna Pueblo, will be acting as moderator for tonight's panel. Jenny is an investigative journalist and media critic who writes about Indigenous affairs in the US and abroad. Her work is featured by the LA Times, The Guardian, the Center for Investigative Reporting, and PBS NewsHour, to name a few. Jenny is also a commentator for such outlets as MSNBC, NPR, and Democracy Now! She is currently launching the newsletter platform, Indigenously Decolonizing Your Newsfeed. In 2020, Jenny received a Mir Award for her essay, The Crisis in Covering Indian Country, published by the Columbia Journalism Review, a media critique on Indigenous invisibility in the colonized press. Other honors include recognition from her months-long coverage of the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, including the Paul Tobokin Memorial Award and Journalist of the Year from the Newswomen's Club of New York. Jenny, how are you tonight?
Charlie, that's such a kind introduction. Goatsi, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us tonight for Tribal Sovereignty and Home. I can't tell you enough how appropriate that title is, because so much of the documentaries that we're featuring tonight not only deal with our self-determination as Indigenous peoples, but also they are stories that are so deeply connected to real lives on the ground today. And so I'd like to just very briefly give you a sense of how tonight will unravel. If we can show our agenda card for the films that we're going to be featuring tonight. We have 4 documentaries that are part of Vision Makers Native American Heritage Month film festival that you can find online, watch on demand, all for free. Our guests that are connected to these films are Mr. Dennis Bowen Sr., former president of the Seneca Nation. We have Misty Frazier, who is also Santee Sioux and Tlingit, Executive Director of the Nebraska Indian Child Welfare Coalition. Chief, I always call him Chief Jim Gray first. Jim Gray, former Principal Chief of the Osage Nation, will then be speaking with us. And then Laura Harris, citizen of the Comanche Nation and Executive Director and CEO of Americans for Indian Opportunity. And each of these guests will be joined and paired with a film that we're going to be discussing. And after we have these very separate conversations, we'll join together in a convening where we'll be taking your questions. And so as you're watching the night and the conversations, please send us your questions. It's not that we won't be ignoring them. We're just saving them till the end where we can all have a group conversation. And so as you see the conversation unravel, please just jot it down, and we're taking note. So let's get started. Our first film is The Lake of Betrayal. It's a documentary directed by Paul Lamont and produced by Scott Sackett, with Caleb Adams of the Seneca tribe as associate producer. And Lake of Betrayal traces the little-known story of the Kinzua Dam on the Allegheny River, the indigenous homelands of the Seneca Nation. It was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to thwart flooding, but not to benefit the tribe, rather the white residents of Philadelphia. Let's take a look at the clip.
Mr. Heron, what was the reaction of the Seneca Nation here when it learned that the land was going to be flooded by water from the dam?
Well, we couldn't believe it at first. After all, we've lived under the Treaty of Canandaigua since 1794, and we thought, well, Congress will decide otherwise.
At the time, however, Congress's decision was based on a policy known as termination that sought to eliminate all tribal sovereignty. Between 1945 and 1960, 113 tribes were terminated, and nearly 1.4 million acres of land was taken.
And they wanted to wash their hands of us and be done with us. They didn't want no more Indian law. They didn't want special programs for Indians. So that was the value in the 50s and 60s. Just wanted us to disappear. They wanted us to just go away, just melt in. Just, what's wrong with you?
Lake of Betrayal, a film you can screen this month as part of Native American Heritage Month. And right now, I'd like to introduce you to Dennis Bowen Sr., former president of the Seneca tribe. Dennis, are you here with us? Hi, Dennis.
Yes.
Hi, Gawatsi. Thank you for joining us tonight. How are you?
Great. Nyawaskano, Daganondat, Shoni Nikayaso. It's good to have the many voices heard all across Turtle Island.
Well, I'm so glad yours is one of them. Thank you so much. I know that it's a great honor to have you here, because to particularly help us understand this little known history that I think so few people really have understood or heard about. You were 13 years old when you saw your homelands get swallowed up by this reservoir. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Every house down the river was burned. The school I went to was burned. George Herron, the person you just seen in this clip, was our neighbor, and he was our president at the time. It was a time of suffering. And when we think about sovereignty and treaties, the Americans have in their Constitution, Article 6, that treaties are the supreme law of the land. We made treaties with the Europeans before the Americans. We made a treaty with the Dutch around the early 1600s, 1615. It's called the Truro Wampum. We still hold that treaty today. So the Treaty of 1794 that was broken by the Kanzua Dam is a treaty that we've gone through our struggle. We're still here. And it'd be important to acknowledge and honor our leadership of that time and our leadership today, because we've struggled, and today we have an economy, a healthcare system. We have Seneca school teachers, Seneca educators. We have a lot of positive work being done, work for employment. But we had to suffer to reach that time. A third of our elders died in a 2-year period of the Kanzua Dam. They dug, I believe, over several thousand graves were desecrated and dug up, including our grandparents from my family, my dad's parents. My uncle, who I worked with in the woods, cutting wood year-round. My grandmother had a wood stove. He died of a broken heart before we had forced relocation. He wouldn't move, and he died. I know that spot, that tree where he died today, and it's grown over. My grandfather died. So many of our elders died during this time, and it was a great suffering. Now, the United States told us it was for flood control. But if you study the history of termination from the mid-1940s, 1945 up to the middle 60s, termination was to take away our people off our homeland and to sell our homeland. And so that was the plan. And so when you look at the relocation, yes.
I want to segue into that. We have a title card that kind of gets at what you're talking about. Chris, if you can show us a fact behind this dam project. The federal government, the Senecas called it conscience money, but the federal government, in exchange for the land, was to give the Senecas $15 million as compensation, to which the tribe used to build new homes and infrastructure in their aftermath of their displacement. And I think the notion, and also as you mentioned, Dennis, there was this agreement in acceptance of that money to agree to have the tribe terminated within a certain time span. I mean, I can only imagine, as you aptly said, around Chief Herron's appearance in that clip that we saw, the former president of the Seneca Nation, what that must have been like on the minds of tribal citizens. But also, there was a sense among your white neighbors that somehow the Senecas were not accepting enough of the deal that they'd made, because some of the white communities that were also displaced didn't really receive any compensation. And so there was a sense that the Senecas were somehow ungrateful for the loss of their treaty protected lands. Can you speak to that a little?
Well, in 1970, President Nixon, in his address to Congress, said the American Indian is the most misunderstood and the least understood person on Turtle Island. And that is the struggle we've had. It isn't just the regular American citizen, it's judges, federal judges, it's congressmen, it's presidents that don't understand sovereignty, and they don't understand the livelihood we have under the beautiful umbrella of sovereignty. And so when that 15 million was part of the compensation plan. President Kennedy's administration did not support the $15 million compensation. It was a group of congressmen that woke up and supported us to oppose the other congressmen. There was one from New Mexico, one from Colorado that wanted to terminate us. They put in that compensation language that the Seneca Nation had 3 years to come up with a termination plan. And one of our late friends, one of our leaders named John Mohawk, his father was on the council during that time. And our president got a phone call from the BIA and said, the government's coming to meet with the council. They have a document to sign. They called as many councilmen as they could. And when they came, they all got a copy of it, and they saw that termination plan that we had to do to terminate ourselves. And John Mohawk's dad took that and threw it on the floor and walked out. And so it was a battle the whole way. And so they said it was for flood control, but it was for hydroelectricity. It was to make money off the resources of our water. The same thing happened on the Missouri River with the Garrison Dam, a hydroelectric project. The Colorado River in Washington, it was for electricity. After World War II, they needed electricity for all the industry and the jobs. And they were going to steal our land to make electricity. It was, yes, there was flood control that was needed, but it was for greed, this greed for wealth, which one of our leaders from long ago told us to be cautious of avarice, have greed for wealth. And so the Americans had that from the get-go. They had that greed for wealth going back to 1096 when the Pope declared the first crusade 924 years ago. And then in 1493, when the Pope at that time signed the Doctrine of Discovery, which said they could invade and take over any land on Mother Earth they wanted. They could kill them, or they could make slaves out of them. So slavery, which they took people from Africa into slavery, was part of that Doctrine of Discovery. There is so much genocide and just a horrible history that when Nixon said we are the most misunderstood and the least understood, no one knows what happened. This is why this panel discussion, and thank you for this program to get the word out. Our story has to continue to be told, and it hasn't been fully heard.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's so buried. It's such buried history, and that's the theme of tonight, is really spotlighting part of our stories that have rarely seen a classroom curriculum, for instance. I mean, these are the kinds of things that people should have learned in school but didn't. And you touched on something that I think is so significant, in that what happened to the Senecas with the Kinsua Dam is not a one-off situation. In fact, you can look from tribal community to tribal community on the Pacific Northwest, in the Columbia tribes, also looking at the Dakota tribes with the Pixlone projects. These flooding, the flooding of tribal lands and the incredible displacement that took place is a shared narrative that so few people know about. Can you just in the last 2 minutes that we have here, give us a sense of what that impact has meant in the long term? You talked about the impact that had on some of the elders dying of broken hearts. For you, as someone who's now lived long enough to understand the intensity of that trauma, can you explain to us what that's like?
We have a great explanation because 75 million people voted for Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago. Those people are the ones that are part of the conservative movement that is anti-sovereignty, anti-treaties. The other 78 that voted for Biden that's the group our leadership will work with. There's a lot of work to do. And that's the group that we need to bring in to this overall picture, because our elders said, as long as we have a homeland, the white man's going to come after us. They come after our children, as we're going to hear with the Indian Child Welfare Act. They're going to break up the Indian family. And so we got to keep our families together and keep our many nations together. And so it's not over. You know, Trump had a picture of, what's his name? Andrew Jackson on his wall. Andrew Jackson. Trump was Andrew Jackson. Christopher Columbus was Andrew Jackson. The Pope was Andrew Jackson.
Right.
Donald Trump was Andrew Jackson. And so we're not going to give up. We are happy for when the Kinzu Dam happened. I don't know if you could find an indigenous lawyer who could defend sovereignty. We didn't have our students in law school at the time. Today, we can ask any nation on Turtle Island. They can come up with 20 indigenous lawyers who are experts at arguing and defending sovereignty. We didn't have that in the Kinzu Dam days when the Garrison Dam was built. So we're building our resources, our strength from within our people, and we need to continue that. And I think this panel is going to help nourish and encourage that work with our young people. Some of them are still in college, getting ready to get involved in healthcare, in education, in the infrastructure, in the economic work that's necessary. You know, we're still growing, and I'd like to see it. You know, but I'm an old timer now. But my grandchildren will see that. You know, we're going to still be here.
Well, I'm so glad that you give us that hopeful ending to this small conversation here, and I look forward to you sharing more at the tail end. On that hopeful note, we're also giving people a chance to just kind of engage a little bit more with these stories behind the film. And in my research and talking with you tonight, I learned that Johnny Cash actually was so moved by what had happened to your Seneca people that he wrote a song. So I looked it up and listened to it on YouTube. You guys can too. It's called "As Long as the Grass Shall Grow." I think we have a title card. I'm not seeing it, but maybe you guys are. And performed by Johnny Cash. It's a great song. And thank you so much, Dennis. We'll talk to you here in a few minutes. That way. Yep. Moving on to our next segment, our feature film that we'd like to share with you is Dawnland. It is a story about the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission that has ever taken place here in the United States around the state of Maine's lopsided rate of separating Native kids from their families. And here, I think the clip we have to share with you is actually the opening. It's quite compelling. Let's take a look.
These hearings on Indian children's welfare is now in session. Would you pull that microphone up as closely as you can?
They went into my home and picked up my children and placed them in a foster home. And I think that they were abused in a foster home.
Well, my brother, he was mistreated by Mr. Kelly, and he slapped him, and he smoked right in his face and puffed right in the face. And
Well, Anna, just a minute, Anna. If if that's too hard for you to talk about it now, you don't have to. Cheryl, I'll leave it up to you about your children coming up with you. Perhaps it's better that they don't.
Well, I was pregnant with Bobby, and the welfare kept coming over there and asking me if I'd give him up for adoption.
You mean while you were pregnant with him?
Yeah.
Before he was even born?
Yeah.
The federal government, for its part, has been conspicuous by its lack of action. It has chosen to allow child welfare agencies to strike at the heart of Indian communities by literally stealing Indian children, on the premise that most Indian children would really be better off growing up non-Indian.
And joining us now is Misty Frazier, tribal citizen of the Santee Sioux and also executive director of the Nebraska Indian Child Welfare Coalition. Misty?
Hi, good evening. Ampeti washte, chante washte na pech yuzapi. Ampo mini boja demi na washichi ya Misty Frazier makiapi. Isanti da makota. I said good evening to you, good day. Shake your hand with a good heart and just a little introduction. Thank you for having me.
Oh, no, I thank you for joining us, Misty. It's wonderful that you can join us tonight. I first want to talk to you about that clip, but I also just want to thank you for all of your, what I call heart work, what you guys do in these trenches. I know when we were discussing things earlier, you were telling me before you got involved with NICWIC that you were working for your tribe for 12 years, and you described it as some of the toughest work you've ever really done in your life. Can you talk a little bit about what your reaction was to that, watching that clip and seeing Senator Abarazik there on the in the hearings? Many people may not know Senator James Abarazik was the signatory of the legislation for the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is central to this film, which is designed to protect Native children from being separated from their families. And that is even now fraught with litigation right now. What was your reaction to seeing that archival footage?
It still really gets me. I've seen a little bit before. I think I had seen this video a long time ago and kind of forgot about it, and kind of put it in the back of my mind. And then and it's a good reminder of the work that I do and the work, why it's so important, and a reminder of why ICWA was passed in the first place.
Yeah, you said that sometimes in your work you have to remind people of the importance of this law, that it's a lot of people may not understand the integrity of it. Can you explain that a little?
Yeah, so in the film it says 1 in 4 children, and so from what I've been told is that it was like 35 to 45% of all Native children were, but with any data, we expect that the number was actually higher. But at that time, 85% of those kids were placed in non-Native foster homes. And so, the goal or the philosophy at that time was to acculturate them into dominant society. And so that was the thought behind the Indian Adoption Project in the United States. And so that's what led up to the Indian Child Welfare Act being enacted in 1978.
Mm-hmm. We have a fact card around the Indian Child Welfare Act that in the 40 plus years that the Indian Child Welfare Act's passage in 1978, there's absolutely been no federal agency that has required any state compliance with ICWA protections. So in a sense, no data tracking, no statistical information in terms of understanding just how many Native children we're talking about that have been removed from their homes. And on top of that, the impact that that's had. Can you, Misty, speak to this? In the film, you know, when we talk about these kind of discoveries to which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission collected data on their own, and in response to that, called it nothing short of cultural genocide, you know, and that also spurred a lot of, you know, reaction from non-Indigenous peoples in terms of, you know, questioning, is it really genocide in our time in the 20th and 21st century? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So yeah, you know, up until the last few years, there hasn't been a lot of data. And, you know, when I started this work back in 2008, was really when NICWIC kind of got started with our coalition. There was like no data. And now we have better data, you know, for us here in Nebraska. And so just recently, there's been a bigger push federally to, and I'm talking within the last 4 years, to have ICWA data that is tracked by the states and reported by the states to track Indian Child Welfare Act cases and the compliance issues. And actually, it's within AFGARs that that there could be penalization if ICWA is not followed. I mean, as far as I know, we've not seen that yet. You know, it's pretty fairly new, so it may be a little while before we start to see that, but that's just within the last few years.
And tell us a little bit about NICWIC, your organization. It's one of the few organizations in Indian country, actually, that's kind of doing the compliance work for the federal government, keeping an eye on states like South Dakota, Nebraska. I know you guys are situated in Nebraska, but there are a few of those organizations keeping tabs on, say, for instance, critical issues of when a child is taken. The way that ICWA is supposed to work is that Native child should be placed in a Native home as opposed to a non-Native home. And all too often, that's, you've noticed in your work that wasn't happening. Maybe an impetus for why you started NICWIC. One of them.
Yeah. So we started back in 2008 as a grassroots organization, and just tracking and just getting together as tribes and other organizations and entities and just people that are interested and have a vested interest in the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so that was kind of how we got started, and just supporting each other. And then we started to see that we were all facing a lot of the same issues in the court systems, and seeing where the issues are at, and then getting data, and then getting better data. And working a lot with Nebraska DHHS. And so anyway, that was in 2008. And then in 2017, we applied for a grant and became to work towards nonprofit status. And so we finally achieved so a lot of what we do is we work with a lot of the federal partners and other state partners that do similar type work. And one of the things that we found out, and I didn't know this until I started doing this work, was that Nebraska has been in the top like 4 in the United States for disproportionality of Native children in the foster care system. And so, I mean, we rank pretty high up there. We have a small population here in Nebraska, but that's another one of the reasons why we started NICWIC. And so I guess just a little bit of explanation on that too. You know, nationwide, we see high disproportionality. And, you know, along with African-American children, you know, just for comparison, are twice as likely to be in foster care than white children. But Native children are 2.7 times more likely. So overall, the total number of children in foster care has gone down, but we still continue to see disproportionality of Native American children in the system. And so that's just kind of, you know, where Nebraska ranks in the mix of that.
You know, Misty, in my research also, I came across some documentation around Native adoption in the 60s, and how one federal brief had mentioned how it was actually cheaper than sending Native kids to boarding schools, which is another part of our child separation legacy, that our relatives were removed from their tribal communities for assimilated purposes at schools like Carlisle Boarding School, which my great-grandfather went to. And so another storyline that just wasn't taught in our schools but should have been. In closing off this segment, the Indian Child Welfare Act is once again under attack. It often gets attacked, but now earlier this year in January, the case Brackeen versus Bernhardt went before the Fifth Circuit in a rare en banc review, which means it went before the whole circuit court for a rehearing to determine whether or not ICWA is constitutional. And it could be disastrous for this law that protects Native families, but I'm glad that you feel hopeful. I like that all of these conversations we're having tonight ends on a kind of high note, because this is heavy stuff. Tell us what gives you optimism.
We had, like I said, we work with a lot of federal partners, and so we had done an ICWA convening here in April 2019, and we brought in some of our federal partners like the National Indian Child Welfare Association, and so they were the ones that really helped me to see the positivity in it, and so they have been on the front lines to defend ICWA, and so they've gotten out to all of the tribes and organizations like ours, Native organizations, non-Native organizations. And so, with that en banc review, there's amicus briefs that get filed in support, and there's also support on the other side as well. And so with the amicus briefs that got filed, there was 486 federally recognized tribes. Altogether right now in the US, there's 570. So we're getting pretty close to 100% of federally recognized tribes, plus there's 59 organizations, and as well as other non-Native organizations, including 26 states, 31 child welfare organizations, 77 members of Congress, and all in support of ICWA. And so I guess that's what really gives me and keeps me positive, and like you said, this isn't the first time that ICWA's been challenged. It's probably not going to be the last, but as long as there are people like the Native American Rights Fund, NICWA, all of the tribes banding together, and I think we can, because the other thing is that this law, and the challenge to ICWA, and what they're saying, it would change a lot of things for federal Indian law. And it's not just ICWA that's being challenged. They're challenging all federal Indian law. And so it would change a lot of things. And so there is a big push and support, and so that just keeps me hopeful to see those numbers of people that support ICWA. So thank you.
Well, Misty, if you have hope after all of this hard work you've been doing for all of these years, I have hope too. So thank you for that. And actually, there's a social media campaign happening this week around the Indian Child Welfare Act. If you're on social media this week, hashtag ICWA for Families is trending. It's a social media campaign just to raise awareness about the Indian Child Welfare Act. And you can learn a lot of stuff from people like the Native American Rights Fund, from NICWIC, and then obviously you can turn to the Nebraska Indian Child Welfare Coalition, Misty's organization that is doing such good work at NICWIC.org. Thanks, Misty, and we'll circle back here in just a little bit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Moving on to our next segment, we take a look at a story that's actually been gaining a lot of attention lately in the legacy media space, the Osage murders. directed and produced by Dan Bigby, citizen of Comanche Nation, and Lily Shangru, a Lakota tribal citizen. And this documentary short is an overview of the century-old tale of the Osage murders, how the Osage Indians became known as the wealthiest people in the world during an oil boom on the reservation, making them ready targets for white greed and injustice. Let's take a look at the clip.
You have to remember that the oil and gas reserve helped fuel the fires of World War I in the United States. And they paid royalties for the privilege of extracting this oil and gas. And this royalty was paid to the Osages. And so these people supposedly became the richest people in the world per capita.
Not surprisingly, the Osages enjoyed their money. New cars, building fine homes decorated in the latest style, and traveling to exotic locations. The Osage became the envy of the world. Major publications of the era printed articles on those rich Indians, the richest people in the world. The public perception generated by the publicity fueled the fires of racism and greed.
What they're doing is they're making fun of the Osage and the use of their money. They're also saying, look, they don't deserve it and they're wasting it. And that's the two messages that come across. This is going against the Puritan work ethics. You work hard and make money. Here are people who are not doing anything and they have unbelievable wealth. And so that you're creating kind of this atmosphere or this idea that somehow or another taking money from the Osage is not wrong.
It was a reign of terror. That's what they called it. There was no other way to describe it. If you were an Osage and you had money and you were full blood, you might as well have been walking around with a target on you. Everybody in the world descended into this area to try to find every possible way to separate the Osage from their money.
And joining us now is who you just heard from, former chief of the Osage Nation, Chief Jim Gray.
Am I on?
You are. Go ahead.
Okay, good.
Hi,
Glad to
Chief.
be
How
here.
are you?
I'm doing well. Hawe Dahenik She, Ikipsi Combra.
Welcome, welcome, and thank you so much for giving us your time tonight and sharing your perspective on this. I know that you write a lot about this legacy now that it's gained quite a bit of attention with a New York Times bestseller, Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann, which is now being turned into a blockbuster film by Martin Scorsese. No slouches in that space. We'll talk a little bit about narrative agency around that in just a minute, because I know that that's something very top of mind for you. But more immediately, something you said to me that stuck with me is that, you know, when we're looking at telling these stories, these aren't fiction-based tales. These have real life implications to them and legacies that run deep and are very present in our lives today. Can you talk a little bit about what that's like, knowing that there's kind of this attention on this legacy that so few people might understand?
I think that what separates this particular story from a Hollywood perspective from many of the other previous treatments of Native Americans in film, I think is one that this is a real story of real Osage people. In fact, one of the unfortunate murders that take place in this story is my great-grandfather's, and my mother, who was his granddaughter, lost her mom and her brother as an infant 2 years later in a car accident. And so by the time she was 2, she was already an orphan. this loss of cultural heritage is lost on the mainstream version of this story, because as you could tell from the clip, a lot of the national attention was focused on the wealth and the extravagant lifestyle that some Osages had, not all, but some, and that made headlines. And unfortunately, the story the Osages tell themselves about that period is vastly different. And so when you talk about having some agency in it, I think my son, who I named Henry Roan after that, my great grandfather, you know, he had an opportunity to talk to the author of the book and the book's story once, and he asked him, he said, "You're not the first person to write about this," you know, and a lot of times they come in and they tell their story and they sell their books and then they leave and they make their money. And I'm just wondering if you could tell me how is your effort any different than those efforts in the past? And so that's kind of the question that I'm asking Hollywood. How is this story going to be any different? Are you going to treat us like fully developed three-dimensional characters that hopefully the audience will care about when unfortunate events occur to them? Because I can't imagine why anybody would want to watch a movie of two-dimensional people that are just destined to die. You know, if that's the way they choose to portray us, then you can understand the need for agency in this story. And hopefully we'll see what happens.
Well, I think that the more of these conversations will help. We have another fact card that we'd like to share, and it's actually related to your great grandfather's unfortunate murder in this legacy, telling the details of U.S. versus Ramsey, 1928, a Supreme Court decision that essentially questioned whether or not the federal government had jurisdiction over Osage tribal justice matters. And in the state of Oklahoma at the time, as you know, there was all this consternation that no, the feds didn't have jurisdiction, because actually at the time there was no real credible law enforcement. And to come out of that that lawsuit in the conversation around agency, David Grann, who's, you know, a New Yorker staff writer, wrote the book Killers of the Flower Moon, framed the narrative around the birth of the FBI. And at the time that the book came out, the FBI was going under all kinds of scrutiny. And so it made it for a very timely look at a rare strand of history around the FBI. But I think from an Indigenous perspective, what we've discussed in the past, Chief Gray, is that actually this story from an Indigenous perspective is, you know, the continued degradation of tribal justice, particularly in an era right now where, you know, our movements are centered around missing and murdered Indigenous women and the real kind of cracks of tribal justice, you know, in the maze of jurisdiction that we have to navigate. Can you talk a little bit just about that, not only as a chief who's had to deal with that on your own, but you know, and how you receive that kind of framing?
Well, I think it's important to know that the Osage Nation got through that period of time, and yes, the FBI was able to achieve a measure of justice for some of those murders. Unfortunately, the only one they could prosecute was the one my great grandfather, because his death occurred on the allotment land, which was not under state jurisdiction or local government jurisdiction of Oklahoma. So they were able to fill that space, but like you said, there was objections to that, and it had to be litigated, and before they could even actually prosecute the crime. And so once they got through that, then they went back and prosecuted the crime. And so in fact, that was a landmark decision that yes, a white person can be prosecuted for killing an Indian. I hate to say that it took that long for that decision to establish precedent, but unfortunately, that was it. As a chief, I was well aware of these stories. My mom named me Roan as my middle name. If a lot of Osages are somewhat not of the same mind. There's not a consensus among our people as to whether or not reliving this experience on a national platform like Apple streaming service or, in the movie theaters or however this thing's going to be rolled out, is going to get a worldwide audience. And a lot of people are going to form their opinions about the Osage people and the Osage Nation, not based on anything we say or do or believe or act, but mostly on what Hollywood says. And so that's the challenge, I think, that, and I'm not saying the Osage Nation is so unique in their troubles that there isn't a reign of terror story in the Cherokee Nation or in Laguna or in the Seneca, in the Cayugas. I mean, it's pretty clear that all tribes have a story that is unique to them, that they want to try to protect. It may not be the job of the tribe to make sure that everyone understands that. But it's more important that the Osages hold on to that for themselves, for their own sake, for their children, to be able to pass that legacy down so that there's a shared experience, so that we understand certain truths that apply to us, that will make us a stronger people, so that we won't, these mistakes, these horrendous acts won't occur again, and take the steps necessary to protect our people from this kind of abuse. So these are the kind of goals that I hope can come from something like this happening.
Well, I think it should be given recognition. Some of the steps that Osage have taken is actually convincing Martin Scorsese to come to the Osage Reservation. It was about this time last year.
Yeah.
To hear the concerns. How did you guys get? Well, you obviously convinced him, and in that space, shared a lot of those concerns you just spoke with us here. And you've been monitoring the progress of this film. Tell us a little bit about where this film is at and what it represents. You mentioned it's going to be maybe the biggest blockbuster we've ever seen focused on Indian country.
Well, according to the trade publications in Hollywood, they're estimating the budget for this film to be somewhere around $250 million. You compare that to, say, Dances with Wolves, adjusted for inflation, it was at that point the biggest budgeted Native American film made, and adjusted for inflation be around $45 million. So you can imagine something on a grander scale being produced here. And I got to give credit to our tribal leadership, Chief Standing Bear. He had a meeting with him, and he persuaded him as best he could to film the movie on the reservation. And even though we are dealing with this pandemic, they were delayed, but they are coming back to film this true to their word. They're going to come back and film here, and hopefully it'll create some opportunities for a lot of the local Osages who might want to be a part of the film or to do some work behind the camera. Who knows? I know one individual is getting the catering contract to provide meals for all the actors and actresses. So kudos for that effort. And as far as the story itself, I have to give credit to Wilson Pipestem, who wrote a letter to Martin Scorsese on behalf of the people in the Gray Horse community to invite him to come and break bread with us, because these are the people in the Gray Horse community within the Osage Nation are the ones who were primarily affected by this particular set of crimes that are documented in this film and in the book. And so, not to say that we all know that there was all kinds of abuse in all the districts of the Osage people. Anybody who had a head was caught up in this in one form or another. So, but in this movie, the people of Gray Horse invited him, and he came with his entourage, and he's had an entourage with him that have served with him for all his previous films. So they all have a really good working relationship together, and there's Academy Awards across the board with all of them. And they sat down and they listened to us and they heard us, and we expressed this from our hearts, just that we're real, and those are our ancestors. And he came away, I think, moved by it. Certainly the power of Osage women in the community. They're not victims, and they're strong leaders, and they're the glue of our community in many ways. And it's hard to imagine that they would get that information strictly from reading the context of that book that David Grand wrote, because to his credit, he wrote the history, but very little of the culture was in the book of the Osage people. And we were there to try to represent that as best we could. And I think it got to him, and he made a change in the screenwriting changes that he talked about later in other interviews, that he had met with us and he decided he wanted to take another look at the script. And so I've got my fingers crossed that we may have had a positive effect on him, but we don't know. So all we can do is hope and be prepared for for whatever as best we can, as best we always have. And so there's anxiety in the air and there's excitement at the same time. We got both going right now.
Well, I know that you're keeping tabs on all of the developments and that you'll let us know. You keep writing about it. If others want to follow along with musings, I encourage you to do so. You can find him on Facebook at Chief Jim Gray? Chief Jim Gray?
Chief Gray.
Chief Gray. And he also wrote a essay that's posted at Indians.com a few months ago, which questions who's going to be the basically main female lead in the piece, who's an Osage woman. And I'm advocating with you, Jim. I hope it's a Native woman and not, someone depicting a Native woman. We could talk about
myself.
Yes, exactly. But follow Jim Gray on Facebook. He posts quite often about what's happening in Hollywood with regard to this film. Stick around, Jim. We'll come back to you. Thank you so much for your feedback here.
Thank you.
Yep. Moving on to our next and last film that we'd like to share with you tonight is one that I've watched from its very beginning from my colleague Juliana Branham. She's a tribal citizen of the Comanche Nation, Indian 101. It's a lovely film. It takes a look at when LaDonna Harris, a Comanche citizen and then wife of U.S. Senator Fred Harris, goes to Washington. And this next clip that we like to feature is here's what she encountered when she gets there. Let's take a look.
What she found when she arrived here was there was this patronizing attitude toward Indian people. Yeah, well, we'll listen to them, but once they leave, we'll do what we think is best.
They weren't really bad people. They were just uninformed people, and we'd have to figure out a different approach to them because, you could hit them in the face, and that wasn't going to teach them very much. So we developed this little course we call Indian 101. Indian 101, the term came about when we found how little national decision makers knew about Native Americans. That no one understood tribes, how they were part of the federal system. It was embarrassing. Many East Coast people thought we didn't exist anymore. It was fascinating. I remember once we were talking to this very high official who's still high in government right now about wanting to do this Indian forum, and he couldn't hear it, and I said it 2-3 times and I gave up. I knew I wasn't getting to him. So when he kind of sat back and he said, I don't think we can do that, but I said, tell me, can you people vote? And there were 3 of us and we all looked at each other and burst into laughter. And it embarrassed him so that he did fund us to do the program.
Oh, wonderful. Let's get joined with Laura Harris, LaDonna's daughter. Laura, are you here with us? Hi.
Weka.
Oh, Goatsi. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Maru weka na nani tatai na namana kwahara matana. And Ura, Jenny, glad to be here.
Oh, Dawae, thank you so much for taking time to be with us. It's wonderful to have you here. What I love about that clip we just saw is your mother's laughter. And I think it's emblematic of the tone of the whole film and her approach of her story and her advocacy is that she really encounters this invisibility factor that is so prevalent in our lives as Indigenous peoples. And in the 1960s, and instead of getting, upset with it, as I'm sure she was frustrated, she let it kind of use it to her advantage of being her charming self and coming up with the terminology Indian 101 to help people understand what we're all about. Can you talk a little bit about the origin of Indian 101?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that all of these films really underline the fact that most Americans really know nothing about Native Americans. And that's not their fault. It's because we don't really study American history. We learn about Europeans coming to America. You know, if we're lucky, we get a chapter. In my day, we barely got a paragraph in history textbooks. Now there's a chapter. And like most Native Americans know, when you're trying to create systemic change, you have to inform the decision makers about who Native Americans are and how we fit in to the political and cultural fabric of the United States. So she would, as all activists, I think, come up against this, would try to change policy and wasn't able to because the decision maker had no idea what she was talking about. So they would say, what tribes are what? Tribes are governments. So tribes are governments. We're a part of the federal system of governments, which originated from the Iroquois Confederacy. That's where the whole idea comes from. Right. And so she did this on a kind of a impromptu basis. And as she came across people who didn't understand what she was talking about or the changes that she was trying to create, she'd have to educate them. And all of us spend a lot of time and energy educating folks. And we hope one day that will change. But from the 1970s, when she started Americans for Indian Opportunity, to today, we're still educating. We actually took her little impromptu presentation to a higher level. We make presentations now to all kinds of folks who want to do business with Indian tribes, or teachers, foundations. And I just did Indian 101 for a group of 6th graders last week. They asked very intelligent questions, much better than what I usually get.
That's amazing. I want to go back to that, but back to your point, we have a fact card from a study in 2015 by the journal Theory and Research in Social Education. And they surveyed schools and found that almost 90% of state history curriculum standards do not mention Native Americans after the year 1900. So yeah, you're right, Laura. It's not your fault. It's not people's fault that they don't really know much about us in terms of who we are in this modern sense. And I like that you are carrying on the Indian 101 curriculum. You mentioned that, you know, some of the things that some of the most common questions you may get are they're surprised to learn that we're tribal governments. I'm curious to hear what these 6th graders asked.
They wanted to know what it was like in the everyday life of a contemporary Native person. Wow. They were thrilled. I have to do a disclaimer. It was my niece's class in Northern California. But they were very well-informed 6th graders. They were in a gifted, talented group. But they did ask questions more contemporaneous than most of the questions that we get. You know, it's really a glaring example of systemic racism. It's not an accident that we're not a part of history books. The United States government has dealt with us after eradication and genocide. The next set of policies were that of assimilation. Mm-hmm. And so each of these eras that we talk about, boarding school, all these things were attempts at just making us regular Americans, believing in individualism. But you know, our cultures are so resilient, and our value systems are so important to us, and I think something that we can contribute to the rest of the world. It really shows you how those policies can affect us up until today. And so there's so many things going on right now to end systemic racism. And we have a lot of work to do in the Indian country.
Very much so. And AIO is so much a part of that with its ambassadors program. I'm such a fan of that program. I've been following its progress for quite a while now. And the ambassadors are everywhere. They're doing good work in all kinds of fields in Indian country. Can you talk a little bit about that? And not even just here in Indian country, but expanding into the world. The Ambassadors for Indian Opportunity program really has an emphasis on looking at the globalization of our Indigenous communities. Can you just talk a little bit about the ambassadorship and that's
it's the only it's the only Native American, or it's the only national Native American leadership program that's founded on a set of core cultural values. We call it Hayaroquit. That means just right in Comanche, but it also means the number 4. And we affectionately call these core values the 4 R's so that we remember them. But the idea is not to get a group of leaders, Native leaders or emerging leaders in a room and give them the 7 best habits of a good leader, or teach them Euro-American styles of leadership. In fact, the very term leadership, we looked it up in the English dictionary, and it says someone who's in authority over others, someone has control over others. And that doesn't match our value system. So that's why we came up with the term ambassadors, because tribal leaders really act like diplomats, intergovernmental affairs experts, because they have to deal with so many different governments and organize how those governments coordinate for the benefit of the tribal government. But we found that peer-to-peer learning, learning about each other's experiences, really what we believe is that everybody has medicine. Everybody has that talent, that personal trait. Comanche certainly believed that. Everybody had to contribute their individual talent to the whole in order to make things balanced and make things work properly. So the ambassadors really learn about how to contribute their medicine in a holistic way, and also how to implement their traditional values in a contemporary context.
I really appreciate the explanation between the leadership and ambassadorship. It's so fitting, and I'm just so grateful that you're carrying on your mother's good work. Thank you so much, Laura, for all you're doing. You can follow the work of the ambassadors. I think we have their Facebook page, facebook.com/AIO/.ambassadors. And I follow them on Facebook, and it's just incredible to see the contributions that our Native professionals are doing right now. And I think that brings us full circle back to what Dennis Bowen was telling us about the hope and the promise he sees when he looks at, more of our young people going to law school, or, understanding the policies that are going to impact us, undoing the kind of institutional racism, that has designed to work against Indigenous peoples in the United States. And so I'd like to bring the forum back together with all 4 of our guests, Laura Harris, Misty Frazier, Dennis Bowen, and Chief Jim Gray, to kind of unpack some of the similarities that we've been discussing tonight. I think Laura really kind of brought it to the fore that, there is a system in place that is meant to challenge our progress. And I think in every situation that we've been discussing tonight is an example of that, on top of also what India 101 addresses, which is chronic invisibility of Indigenous peoples. And so in that spirit, and in this place we call tribal sovereignty and home. Maybe Dennis, tell us a little bit of your thoughts. One thing that when we discussed, some of these commonalities, something that has stayed with me from our conversation from leading up to this was that we call it institutional racism, and you called it actually something a little bit more strong, institutional violence. That what happened with the Kansua Dam was a violence on the Seneca people. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, we have currently institutional violence on Turtle Island in the form of voter suppression in communities of color, the black vote, the Hispanic vote. That's a struggle. We have institutional violence in housing, so that people of color live in the poorest housing communities, and they don't have access to better housing. There's healthcare inequities that are going on, which is institutional violence. And so, yes, progress is being made, but like a great leader, and his name was Malcolm, he said, you can't stab me in the back 7 inches, pull it out 2 inches, and call it progress. So, yes, we have a lot more work to do to pull it out the other 5 inches out of our back. And our people have been doing that. My wife and I can name 6 Navajo doctors. When we worked in the hospital in Tuba City, there was only 1 Navajo doctor. And so the other nations, there's Lakota doctors, there's Pueblo doctors, and so it's getting better, but it's still hard. And as I listened to Jim, in the 70s, we played basketball with our friends who worked in the police department, who moved up in the department to be criminal investigators, who were sent to the FBI school in Virginia to learn criminal investigation, came home, and when there was a violent crime, there was a death, our Navajo criminal investigators did a perfect investigation, but yet that federal judge pushed that Indian investigation paper to the side and asked the FBI investigator, who didn't want to come up from Phoenix to Indian country. They sent the youngest, newest FBI agent who didn't do a good investigation, didn't know how to handle talking to families. The crime scene was already walked on by dogs and people walking through the crime scene. And so the FBI investigation was incomplete. And the perpetrator was back on the street 2 months later. And we didn't feel there was justice. You know, that's the work we got to do in justice, that there's you can go to healthcare, you can go to housing, and then education, decolonizing the education system, which was basically what we talked about. In 1970, when the National Indian Education Association was just starting out, LaDonna Harris was one of our guest speakers at the convention. Everyone was excited because she had access to people in Washington to fight for us. And now we knew she had a tough road. She had a lot of doors that weren't open, that were closed, but she was there. We felt hopeful. Look how much we've grown since 1970 in education. Mm-hmm. We have more, my wife and I can name people that have doctorate degrees. Our daughter is close to finishing her doctorate degree in education. And we've got students that are achieving, and they leave home, they go to MIT, they go to Harvard, they go to Stanford. Yes, and that's family separation, parent from child. Your child goes away, but we got to stay on this. And we do this with our prayer life.
Thank you
It's our
so
prayer
much.
life that brought us here. And we got to keep that up. That's the part of a holistic, beautiful life. And I'm sure all of our people on the panel tonight, they have their own prayer life. I can hear it. I listen to them. That's the beginning of healing, is to listen. Then we heal. But it doesn't end there. We're going to move on. Some people want to move on without listening and healing. So we got to do that work. And it starts with listening. And this is what this panel is for, to have people out there to listen.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. You've spelled it out and set it up so wonderfully, looking at our very present situation in this political moment, a historic election, not just for America, but for Indian country. We will now have 6 congressional representatives for the first time ever. It's an extraordinary representation.
Women.
Yeah, and our women are leading in incredible ways and incredible numbers. And then I like also what you had to say, Dennis, about the healing. And I think that also lends itself to women leadership, where you have representatives like Deb Haaland who have introduced legislation around healing. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission at a national level to look at our issue of boarding school legacies that have led to adoptions. Misty, I'm curious, your thoughts about how you're feeling in this moment, as we turn a political corner.
Thanks for asking. I'm super excited. It's so exciting to see, and to see that glass ceiling just shatter, with all of this congressional representation. I mean, it's so awesome. Like it almost makes me want to get emotional because it's so amazing. And I'm glad that you were talking about healing, and when we talk about the Indian Child Welfare Act and all of the damage that has caused, and I love that what Dennis had said about institutional violence, that's the child welfare system. That's, also, as well as all of the other systems that he had talked about, the systemic racism. But and so it's a great time of healing, and it's been several years since that healing has started. We still have a long way to go, but and that's kind of always the message that I like to send to the families that we work with and that we help. And maybe you might have to bleep me out, but I tell them they have to fight like hell, because we are overcoming many, many years of historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. And we have to fight like hell to preserve our families, to help our families heal. And, once we heal ourselves and we can heal our families, then we heal our tribes. And so I'm glad that you brought that up about healing.
Oh, well, Misty, thank you so much for those encouraging and fighting words. Yes, let's all fight like hell. I want to give some honor to our audience. A lot of them are non-native, and they're watching us and learning, and really, I think, looking for ways to support Indigenous rights, our struggle. I don't know, Laura, Jim, what do you guys recommend? What do you say to people when they ask you how they can help and contribute and be a good ally?
You want to go first?
Sure. You know what you could do right this minute is get on that Twitter thing for ICWA to protect ICWA. There is forces out there trying to do away with the Indian Child Welfare Act, and it is fundamental to tribal sovereignty. The right for government to be able to take care of its children, its own citizens, is fundamental to sovereignty. So ICWA is important to all of us. And right now, if you like, you said, Jenny, hashtag ICWA for families, and become a part of that conversation. Learn about it. Learn about how since the United States was created, they've come after our children one way or another. And the Senator Averesk is a hero. My sister worked for Senator Averesk at that time, and she graduated from law school in 1976. And at that time, there were only 14 Native American lawyers.
Oh my goodness.
Now there's hundreds of them. It's like Misty said, just so hopeful because there's so many activists, so many leaders on all fronts, but we have a lot of fronts. We have a lot of fronts that we have to, we have competing priorities. We have our hands full all the time, but we try to come together in solidarity on special issues like the protection of the Indian Child Welfare Act, join in the cause, listen. There's a lot of great movies out now. Two of the movies featured tonight are made by Comanches. I don't know if that's an accident, but I like it. And we're everywhere. But just educate yourself. There's so much information. National Museum of the American Indian, Native Americans and Philanthropy, First Nations Development Institute. They all have wonderful information on their websites.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Jim? You have any suggestions for where people can, just follow along on social media? What are some of the resources that, you tune into?
I would like to encourage folks that are just now getting exposed to some of the Native American issues that we're facing, getting a good education tonight. But if it piques your interest to follow up, I would like for you to take some time to be a more discerning reader of mainstream news when it gets when they cover our stories. A lot of misinformation occurred during the Washington football team's decision to get rid of their mascot, for example.
Yes.
A lot of unnecessary negative things were thrown around by those that wanted to keep that mascot. Why they wanted to keep that mascot when the people that they're trying to honor don't reflect anything remotely to that image doesn't reflect anything remotely to the reality of our lives. So why on earth would you want to perpetuate a stereotype such as that? Because what it does is that it dehumanizes us. It makes us less human in a way that they don't care about our children. They don't care about our rights. They don't care about our treaties. They don't care about any of those things that we're fighting for. And we have a responsibility to continue to fight those battles every generation. But our job is not made easier if the mainstream society doesn't understand it. We should insist on continuing to educate. And I know you fought this battle for years, Jenny, in the news industry.
Yes.
They need to do a better job, and we need to insist on it. I mean, I would hope that maybe at some point, the critics who will review this movie that's coming out about our people will take the time to understand who we are so they can review it properly, I think we have a lot of work to do in this area. And unfortunately, indifference and ignorance, whether real or manufactured, can drive public policy that affects our lives and the lives of our people in our community. It would be a wonderful service if the rest of the country took the time to spend the time to understand the Native American story, and in the hopes that maybe the people that we put in Washington, D.C., certainly people like Deb Haaland are great advocates for us. But her strength in being able to persuade others that are not Indian is going to be based on the people that they represent. And if those folks are out there in the country that they think that maybe we got in the wrong deal and maybe we need better representation, that they should call their congressmen and senators and try to encourage them to follow Deb Haaland's lead and to follow Sharice David's lead and to follow Tom Cole's lead. And hopefully we'll get some real change that we know we all need in our communities. So that's my 2 bits.
Oh, well, those are all so good. And I love how the intersection was all that I was hoping for and envisioned in this group convening. There's so much more to say, and of course, thank you, Jim, for just recognizing the media watchdogging I do. It is a component of my newsletter, Indigenously. You can find that at indigenously.org, where we have a segment in the newsletter called "The Crisis in Covering Indian Country," because it is, as Jim said. We're so often misreported in the press, largely because of what, Jim, you've so aptly noted. No one's really taking the time. And we kind of saw that also around our Native vote this year, which was the topic of our most recent story. So thank you for that recognition. Thank you all for your wonderful insight, your stories, your heart work, everything that you guys are contributing to our Indigenous futures. Dawa A, I'm going to hand it over to Charlie to carry us out, and safety to you all and your families. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, tonight's panel discussion is just another example of the powerful spirit of survival and self-determination that lives in the hearts of all Native Americans. The overwhelming will to carry on and overcome. I'd like to offer a big thanks to our brothers and sisters for agreeing to be part of this panel, the whole relatives. Jenny, thank you for acting as moderator this evening. We at Vision Maker Media truly appreciate your steadfastness in uncovering the hidden truths of our nation.
Oh, thank you.
If you were moved tonight to learn more, you can see all the films featured tonight for free at visionmakermedia.org through November 30th. Also, be sure to check out the World Channel throughout the month of November as they showcase numerous Native American films in celebration of Native American Heritage Month. Blood Memory is one of those outstanding films that actually had its broadcast premiere on the World Channel tonight. The film centers around the Indian Child Welfare Act and the adoption era. You can stream Blood Memory right now on worldchannel.org as part of their emotionally driven America Reframed series. Until next time, everyone, miigwish nikanins. May the Creator keep you healthy and guide your steps.
We want our children and our grandchildren, but we are not allowed to keep them.
You know, they took you away and you never went back.
For decades, U.S. adoption policies tore Native American families.
Good job, guys.
25 to 35% of all American Indian children were removed from their homes. 90% of those children were in non-Native families.
I came home from school one day, second grade, first grade, and my brother was gone.
They may have been told they weren't wanted. I was told I wasn't wanted.
An incalculable loss of culture and community.
So it was to literally kill the culture, the language, turn the Native person into a white person.
But I was 35 years old when I went home for the first time.
Now, the adopted and fostered relatives are coming together to heal and reconnect with their heritage.
What makes us Indian is our blood, who we are, our relatives, our community. We were always Indian. That just can't be taken. We just didn't have a way to express it.
Blood Memory on America Reframed.